The cold arrived the way death always does in the mountains, not with drama, but with certainty. It came on a Tuesday night in the deep heart of January 1884, slipping down from the high peaks above the gray stone valley in Colorado like a vast, silent tide. By midnight, the thermometer nailed to the outer wall of a low mound of earth and stone, a structure most men would have dismissed as a burrow, a den, something built by an animal rather than a human being, had dropped to 31 degrees below zero. Inside, a young woman pressed her bare palm flat against the back wall. The wall was granite, ancient, solid, unmoved by the century, and it was warm, not hot, not blazing, but warm in the way that a living thing is warm, with a deep, steady, radiating heat that came not from the surface, but from somewhere far inside, from the compressed memory of 1,000 summers stored in the dark heart of the mountain. Eliza Holt held her hand against that wall for a long moment, her eyes closed, her breathing slow. Outside, the wind moved across the canyon rim with a sound like a scream held at a distance. The cold out there was a lethal thing, the kind that found the seams of a man's coat and exploited them, that turned exposed skin white in minutes, that had already in the weeks prior taken one young ranch hand who had simply misjudged the distance between two fence lines in the dark. The valley below was suffering. The valley below was enduring a winter that the old-timers said reminded them of 1868, a season that had broken families and driven livestock mad with cold. But here in this low, half-buried room of stone and earth and compressed sod, the air temperature held at 42 degrees Fahrenheit, a differential of 73 degrees between her world and the one waiting 6 inches beyond her door. She had not defeated the winter. She had done something quieter and in some ways more profound. She had simply refused to participate in it on its own terms. Her father had told her she could do this. He had told her when she was 12 years old, sitting by a quarry fire in the long light of a Colorado summer evening, pressing a warm stone into her small hands. She had believed him then the way children believe the people they love, with a wholeness that asks no proof. Now she knew, and knowing was a different thing entirely. 6 weeks earlier, she had nothing but the belief. 6 weeks earlier, she had been standing in the dirt yard of a log cabin she no longer owned, watching 2 men ride toward her on horses that moved with the unhurried confidence of animals whose riders expected no resistance. The road through the Greystone Valley in October of 1883 was already showing its autumn character, 2 ruts pressed into yellowing grass, the land making its annual concession to the wagons that traveled it before closing up for the winter. The mountains to the west held their first permanent caps of white. The air had that particular crystalline quality that the high country develops in the weeks before the real cold arrives sharp enough to make a man's thoughts come clear and quick.
Eliza had been loading her wagon for 3 days, not packing to leave, packing to survive. There was a difference, and she understood it precisely. She moved with the economical, unhurried motion of a woman who had measured the task against the time available and found them roughly equal. Flour in the heavy sacks pressed down and tied, dried beans, salted pork sealed in a crate. The cast iron pot that had been her mother's, then hers, its weight, a kind of ballast against the lightness of everything else she was losing. Her father's tools, the chisels, the wedges, the long-handled hammer with the worn leather grip, and the small geological hammer, its head pointed and precise, its handle smooth from years of use, in her father's hand, and then in hers. She packed that one last wrapped in a piece of canvas placed at the top of the wagon bed, where she could reach it quickly. She heard the horses before she saw them. She straightened her back and watched them come over the low rise. 2 riders, one with the posture of a man who had spent his entire life being obeyed, and one younger, with the uneasy slouch of someone who has learned to be ashamed of his own comfort. Harlan Voss was 61 years old and looked like something that the land itself had produced heavy-set weathered to the color of old saddle leather, with pale eyes that had developed the habit of measuring everything they looked at in terms of its value and its vulnerability. He had come to this valley 20 years ago with capital ambition and a talent for identifying the precise moment when a man's hope became his weakness.
He owned the general's door. He held the note on a significant portion of the valley's farmland. He controlled the flow of credit the way a miller controls water opening and closing the gates according to his own calculations.
His nephew, Caden Voss, was 20 years old, dark-haired, and miserable in a way he had not yet learned to conceal. He kept his eyes on the middle distance fixed on some point beyond the barn, as if looking at Eliza directly was a thing he could not bring himself to do. Harlan dismounted. His boots settled into the soft earth with the solid finality of a man planting a flag. He held out a folded document. "The deed transferred to my name at noon yesterday, Mrs. Holt, as was agreed." His voice had no apology in it. It had no cruelty either, which was somehow worse. It was the voice of a man conducting a transaction, closing a ledger entry, moving on to the next item on a long list. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and took the paper. She unfolded it slowly, reading it with the careful attention she gave to everything, and what she found there confirmed what she already knew. The legal language was precise. The signatures were genuine. Her husband Daniel's name written in his careful, slightly tilted hand was exactly as she remembered it. And then she looked at the date. Daniel Holt had signed this document on the 14th of June. She knew that date. She remembered that week. It was the week that Harlan Voss had sold Daniel a consignment of seed grain at a price that seemed almost generous. A price that had made Daniel come home with the particular light in his eyes he got when he believed he had finally found the angle that was going to change everything. He had planted that grain, and it had come up sparse and weak and wrong because the grain was old stock milled over remnants that Voss had taken in on another debt and passed along to Daniel at full price. The harvest that summer had been a disaster, and it was precisely that disaster that had driven Daniel desperate and too proud to say so to borrow the money that Voss now held the note on. Eliza stood with the deed in her hands and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she was not looking at a business transaction. She was looking at a mechanism, a trap built in 2 stages separated by a growing season, so that the connection between them was invisible to everyone except the man who had designed it, and now apparently to the woman who was holding the result. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket. "I need more time," she said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact offered in the spirit of accuracy. Harlan gave a slight shake of his head. "The season doesn't negotiate, Mrs. Holt. Neither do I. You have until the first snow. After that, you'll be trespassing on my property." He looked at the wagon at the organized, methodical evidence of her preparations. Something moved behind his eyes, not sympathy, but perhaps a brief, reluctant acknowledgement of her competence. "Be sensible. Go to whatever family you have. There's nothing here for you now." "There is no family to go to," Liza said. He stopped. He did not turn around. "That is your circumstance," he said. "Not mine." He swung himself back onto his horse with the ease of a man half his age and rode away without looking back. Caden followed, and for just a moment, one brief moment before he crested the rise, he turned and looked at Eliza with an expression she could not fully read. It was not satisfaction. It was not quite guilt. It was something that lived in the complicated territory between the two. Then they were gone, and she was alone with the sound of the wind moving through the dying grass. She stood for a moment. Then she picked up a sack of seed potatoes from the ground and swung it onto the wagon bed. There was work to do. The town of Harmony Creek, which is what the settlers in the Greystone Valley called their small cluster of buildings, with the optimism of people who have committed to a difficult place and need to believe it has a future, made up its mind about Eliza Holt within 48 hours. The verdict was delivered over fence posts and store counters murmured in the narrow aisles between the shelves of Voss's general store, and formalized in its way from the pulpit of the small wooden church on the eastern edge of town. Reverend Stokes was a tall man with a long face and the particular manner of someone who has confused the volume of his own voice with the weight of his convictions. He preached on the Sunday after Eliza received the deed, a sermon on the sin of pride, on the foolishness of the individual who places their own judgment above the wisdom of community and God. He did not say her name. He did not need to. Every man and woman in that small church understood precisely of whom he spoke, and they looked at each other with the solemn, knowing expressions of people who have been given official permission to stop worrying about someone. She would be back, they agreed. Before the first hard frost, she would come walking out of the canyon chastened and cold. and the Reverend would take her in at the poorhouse, and life would resume its familiar configurations. Or she would not come back at all. Either outcome confirmed the narrative they needed, that the world had a shape, that the shape was right, and that deviation from it carried consequences. What they did not know, what none of them knew, except for one old man sitting alone in his smithy that Sunday afternoon, staring at the cold forge, was that Eliza Holt was not lost. She was not wandering. She was working from a map. The map existed in a worn leather notebook, the pages soft from years of handling the handwriting, dense and precise and slightly faded. It had belonged to Thomas Holt, Eliza's father, who had been a quarryman in his youth, then a stonemason, and finally, in the last decade of his life, something closer to a practical geologist. A man who had developed through long years of physical engagement with rock, an intuitive understanding of how stone behaved, how it held heat, how it remembered pressure and time in ways that most men never thought to consider. Thomas had not been an educated man, not in any formal sense, but he had been a precise one, and he had understood things that the educated men of his era were only beginning to articulate in the language of science. He had begun taking Eliza to the quarry when she was 8 years old. Not because he lacked other options, but because he recognized in her the same quality he valued most in himself: attention. She watched. She listened. She asked questions that were not about the surface of things, but about what lay beneath. On long summer afternoons, while other girls her age were learning needlepoint and the management of a household, Eliza Holt was learning to read stone. Her father would stand her before a sheer rock face and point. "Don't look at the cracks," he would tell her. "Look at the stone between the cracks. See the grain, the way it flows. That's the story of how this mountain was made. That story tells you where it's strong and where it will give way." He taught her to tap the rock with the pointed head of the geological hammer and listen to what came back. A solid ringing tone meant sound stone, reliable stone that would bear weight and hold its form against pressure and time. A dull, muted thud meant fracture lines within instability, a surface that looked whole but was already failing. "Trust the ring," he said. "Always trust the ring." The lesson she remembered most vividly, the one that had come back to her now in the shadow of the canyon walls, with the first serious cold settling into the valley, like a judgment had come on an evening in late October, the year she turned 12. They had been working all day on the foundation stones for a new building in the next town over, and her father had sat down by a small fire as the light failed, and he had reached into the coals with a pair of tongs and withdrawn a stone that had been sitting in the heat for hours. He wrapped it in burlap and handed it to her. It was heavy, and the heat coming off it was not the sharp, bright heat of a flame, but something deeper, a slow, radiating warmth that seemed to come from the stone's interior rather than its surface. She had held it in her lap, feeling that warmth move through the fabric of her skirt, and it had felt in some way she could not articulate, like being held. "Stone is a battery for the sun," her father said, looking at the fire. "It soaks up the heat over time, soaks it up slow, and then it holds it long after the source is gone. It gives it back the same way it took it in. Slow, patient." He was quiet for a moment. "The earth does the same thing. You dig down far enough past where the frost can reach, and the ground is never truly frozen. There's warmth down there from the last summer and the summer before that. The earth remembers." She had not understood the full significance of what he was telling her. She was 12, and the stone was warm, and her father's voice was low and calm, and the fire was beautiful in the gathering dark. But she had remembered. She had packed the memory away somewhere inside herself, in the deep storage where the most important things go. The things that don't announce their value until the precise moment they are needed. That moment had arrived the first week of October 1883, when Eliza Holt's wagon turned west instead of east at the junction below her former homestead, and the small settlement of Harmony Creek watched her go with the collective certainty that she was driving herself toward her own extinction. The canyon the locals called Devil's Throat was a narrow slash in the granite wall of the mountains, a place the valley's settlers treated with the particular suspicion that people reserve for spaces that do not conform to their plans. It was dark. It was subject to sudden violent winds that funneled through its narrow passage without warning. The floor was loose scree and exposed rock, useless for farming, difficult for cattle. The walls were sheer in places and unstable in others. No one built in Devil's Throat. No one even grazed their animals there. What no one in the valley knew, what Eliza herself had not fully understood until she opened her father's notebook in the long, cold dark of her first night in the canyon, was that Thomas Holt had been in this place before. The page was near the back of the notebook, filled with his dense handwriting in the faded pencil he always used. He had described the canyon with a geologist's precision. The granite formation of the north wall, the massive overhang that jutted out nearly 20 feet and had been scoured smooth by millennia of wind, the south-facing orientation that would capture the low winter sun, the deep soil beneath the overhang that would accept excavation. He had noted the coordinates, or rather, his own system of landmarks and measurements that served the same purpose. And in the margin in handwriting that was slightly different, slightly more careful, as if he had written it at a separate time, and with particular intention, there were 4 words. She will know why. Eliza sat in the dark with the notebook open in her lap for a long time. She did not know when her father had been here. She did not know what had brought him to this specific canyon, to this specific piece of granite, at whatever point in his life it had happened. She did not know whether he had left these notes for her, deliberately knowing she might need them, or whether it was a coincidence of such precision that it amounted to the same thing. What she knew was that he had found the same place she had been searching for, by whatever instinct or knowledge had guided both of them to the same conclusion. She folded the notebook carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of her coat close to her body. In the morning, she took the geological hammer from its canvas wrapping and walked the length of the canyon, tapping the walls, listening to what they told her. The days that followed were the hardest of her life, and she had not lived an easy life. She found the location on her third day in the canyon, the north wall south-facing exactly as her father had described. The overhang was massive, a ceiling of solid granite that a man could stand under without stooping, extending outward far enough to create a sheltered space of significant size. She tapped the rock above and around it with methodical patience, and heard every time the clear, ringing tone of sound stone. No fractures, no hidden weakness. The mountain here was solid all the way down to its oldest self. The ground beneath was decomposed granite mixed with deep soil. It would take a pick and shovel, and it would take time, and it would take more physical strength than she was certain she possessed. She started anyway. She worked from the first gray light until the sun left the canyon floor in the mid-afternoon, and then she worked a little longer by feel until the darkness became a genuine impediment. She was excavating a space 10 feet by 12, digging 4 feet down into the slope so that the earth itself would form 3 of her walls with the granite face of the mountain as the 4th and most important. Her hands blistered on the first day. By the 3rd day, the blisters had opened and bled and dried and reopened. By the end of the first week, her hands had begun to develop the hard, specific calluses of someone who has entered into a permanent reckoning with manual work. Her back ached in a way that was different from any ache she had known before, deeper, more structural, as if the work was not just tiring her muscles, but rearranging the very architecture of her body. One night in the 2nd week, a front of ice and sleet moved through the canyon without warning, and the canvas she had rigged as a temporary shelter for her excavation and for herself was torn partially free by the wind and collapsed onto her as she slept. She woke in the cold dark, soaked with canvas pressing down on her, and the sound of sleet hitting the ground around her like thrown gravel. She lay there for a moment in the dark. She was tired in a way that went past physical exhaustion into something that felt almost philosophical. She was cold. Her hands hurt. The work ahead of her was still immense, and she had not slept properly in 8 days, and there was no one coming to help her, and no one who expected her to succeed, and the temperature was dropping. And then she thought of her father's hands, the maps of healed cuts and permanent calluses, the hands of a man who had spent his life in daily physical argument with stone and had won over and over, not by being stronger than the stone, but by being more patient than it. She pushed the canvas off. She got up.
She found her coat in the dark and put it on. In the morning, she repaired the canvas shelter and kept digging.
The walls went up stone by stone, fitted together in the dry stack method her father had taught her. No mortar, just weight and geometry, and the careful selection of stones that locked against each other, like the pieces of a puzzle designed by the mountain itself. Each stone had to be lifted, tested for fit, tried in position, and often moved again. It was slow. It was the kind of work that would have broken a person who needed to see progress in order to continue. Eliza did not need to see progress. She needed to see the next stone. The roof was heavy canvas stretched over the opening and pinned along the back edge to the granite wall. With iron pythons, she drove into a thin crack with a hammer. Over the canvas, she piled the excavated soil, then cut thick squares of sod from a grassy area near the canyon's mouth and laid them over the soil in overlapping layers. The combined weight of earth and grass and moisture would make the roof dense enough to insulate and shed snow. The hearth she built against the granite back wall, small and deep, designed not for dramatic fire, but for efficient, sustained combustion. The chimney was the most difficult element, a narrow channel of carefully selected flat stones, fitted together along the rock face, angled to create the draft that would carry smoke up and out from under the overhang, while simultaneously heating the maximum surface area of stone along its length. The principle was simple. The fire would heat the air, but more importantly, the fire would heat the stone. And the stone, the immense, patient, ancient stone, would hold that heat and release it slowly through the hours when the fire burned low or went out entirely. The mountain would become her partner. The mountain would do the work she could not sustain alone. She finished on the first day of November, with the smell of serious winter already in the air and gray clouds gathered permanently above the peaks. She stood back and looked at what she had built. From any distance, it was nearly invisible, a low mound in the canyon floor, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the rock face where the chimney emerged. Up close, the stone walls were solid and true, the sod roof tight and smooth, the door, heavy planking covered in canvas stuffed with grass, hung correctly on iron hinges she had salvaged from the old barn. It was not a cabin. It was not a house. It was something older than either of those words, something that the mountains themselves might have made if they had decided one season to try being hospitable. She walked to the back wall and pressed her palm flat against the granite. She had been burning small fires in the hearth for the past 3 days, not for warmth, but for this, for the patient work of loading the stone with heat, the way you load a battery, the way you prepare something to do its job over a long period of time. The stone was warm, not hot, warm, with that deep, resonant interior warmth that she had first felt as a 12-year-old girl sitting by a quarry fire with a burlap-wrapped stone in her lap. She thought of her father. She thought of his hands. She thought of his voice saying without particular drama, the way he said everything,
The earth remembers. She believed that then. She was beginning now to know it. But knowing required proof that the believing never demanded. And real proof, the kind that would sustain her through what was coming, had not yet arrived.
It would arrive on the night of November 8th, when the first serious storm of the season moved through the canyon, and the world outside her door became a place that no unprotected living thing could survive. It would arrive in the form of a thermometer, reading taken at midnight, with fingers that went numb in the 60 seconds they were exposed to the open air. Outside, 27 degrees below zero. Inside, 47 degrees above. She brought the thermometer back through the door and looked at it in the lantern light for a long time. Then she walked to the back wall and pressed her palm against the granite. It was warm. Her father had told her the truth. The stone remembered summer, and so standing alone in the half-dark of a buried room, while the worst winter in a generation tore itself apart against the canyon walls above. Her Eliza Holt allowed herself one thing she had not permitted since October. She allowed herself to be certain, not hopeful, not cautious, certain. She would survive this winter. The difficulty of it was all that remained in doubt. The cold settled into the Greystone Valley, the way a creditor settles into a chair with the patient, immovable confidence of someone who knows the debt will be paid eventually, one way or another. November moved through its weeks with a methodical cruelty. The sky lost its blue, entirely replaced by a low, pewter-colored ceiling that pressed down on the mountains and the valley below with the weight of something that had made up its mind. The temperature dropped in increments each morning, a few degrees colder than the last, as if the season were conducting an experiment to determine exactly how much the land and the people on it could endure. Inside Devil's Throat, Eliza Holt was learning the rhythms of her new life. She rose before full light in the particular darkness that exists between the last of the night and the first gray suggestion of morning. The fire in the hearth burned low by that hour, reduced to coals, but the granite wall behind it still radiated its steady, patient warmth into the small room. The air temperature had settled on most mornings, somewhere between 40 and 44 degrees, cool enough to make her breath visible in the lantern light, but far from the lethal cold waiting beyond her door. She fed the ox first. She had built a lean-to against the outer wall of the dugout on the eastern side. 3 walls of stacked stone and a canvas roof weighted with sod close enough to the main structure that the animal's body heat added a small but real measure of warmth to the overall system. The ox, a broad, phlegmatic animal named nothing in particular, because Daniel had never gotten around to naming things he considered tools, accepted his morning ration with the same complete lack of drama with which he accepted everything else. Eliza had come to appreciate this quality in him. In a world that was rapidly becoming defined by extremes, his steadiness felt like a form of wisdom. After the ox, she tended the fire. Not the roaring fire of a person trying to heat a space quickly, but the careful, economical fire of someone who understood that the goal was not flame, but thermal mass, not brightness, but the slow, sustained charging of the stone that did the real work of keeping her alive. She added wood in measured amounts, monitoring the chimney draw by the behavior of the smoke, adjusting the ventilation pipe to maintain the right balance between combustion and fresh air. Her father had taught her the difference between heating a room and heating a building. A room, he said, you heat with fire. A building, a real structure, one meant to endure you heat with thought. She ground flour in the mornings, working the small hand mill with the steady rhythm that her arms had adapted to over the first 2 weeks. She mended her clothes, working by lantern light with the careful stitches of a woman who understood that a torn seam in this cold was not an inconvenience, but a potential casualty. She read from the single book she had brought, a worn copy of Shakespeare's collected works. The binding cracked and the pages soft from years of handling, not for entertainment precisely, but for the discipline of it, for the way it kept her mind from turning inward and feeding on itself. In the afternoons, when the light was best, a brief angled shaft of winter sun that crossed the canyon's southern opening for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the day, she worked on the ongoing refinements of her shelter. The chimney needed adjustment at the upper joint, where she had detected a slight reduction in draw during particularly cold mornings. The door frame needed recaulking with packed grass, where the wood had contracted in the cold and left small gaps. The lean-to wall on the north side needed an additional course of stone, where the wind came through in a way she could feel, but not quite locate. She was utterly isolated. Harmony Creek was 4 miles away across terrain that had become, after the first serious snowfall, a landscape of deceptive shifting difficulty. The snow in the canyon floor was packed and navigable, but the open country between the canyon's mouth and the valley's edge was a different matter entirely. Deep drifts concealed ice, the particular disorientation that descends on a person in flat, white, featureless ground, when the light is flat and the horizon is impossible to read. She did not try to go to town. She did not expect anyone from town to come to her. She was wrong about the second part. Stellan Pruitt arrived on a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of November, moving through the snow on a pair of wide, flat snowshoes he had made himself from white ash and rawhide, the kind of practical ingenuity that characterized men who had spent their working lives solving problems with whatever materials were at hand. He was 55 years old, built close to the ground, with a blacksmith's arms and a blacksmith's habit of silence, the professional quiet of a man who had learned that the fire and the iron tell you what you need to know if you stop talking long enough to listen. He had told himself he was coming out of curiosity, but the set of his jaw as he approached the dugout entrance and the way he looked at the thin column of smoke rising from the canyon wall with an expression that was equal parts relief and something harder to name that told a different story. He had expected to find a frozen wagon. He had expected to find the evidence of a decision that had gone as badly as everyone in Harmony Creek had predicted it would go. He found instead a cleared path leading from the dugout entrance to the lean-to.
He found stacked firewood arranged under a small canvas overhang protected from the snow. He found a thermometer nailed to the outer wall, and without thinking, he leaned forward and read it. 19 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature outside was 6 below zero. He stood there a moment looking at the numbers. Then the door opened, and Eliza looked out at him with the calm, unsurprised expression of a woman who had stopped being startled by what the world did. She offered him tea weak from leaves used twice, but hot. He accepted without ceremony
And ducked through the low door into the warmth of the dugout. He stood inside for a moment, letting his eyes adjust.
He was a practical man. He understood structures and materials and the way heat moved through space. He had built his own smithy from stone and timber 20 years ago, and he understood in the professional way of someone who works with heat every day the relationship between thermal mass and sustained temperature. But what he was looking at confounded him. Not because it was incomprehensible, but because it was so simple. The back wall of natural granite heated from below by the hearth. The low ceiling of sod and soil. The 3 thick walls of fitted stone. The small, efficient fire. It was a root cellar. It was a den. It was something that had no name in the architectural vocabulary of 1883, because no one had thought to build one intentionally. He sat on the low stool she offered and drank his tea and said very little because Stellan Pruitt had not come all this way to talk. He had come to see. He saw the thermometer on the inside wall positioned away from the direct heat of the hearth reading 45 degrees. He saw the organized, clean interior, everything in its place, everything with a purpose, nothing wasted. He saw the Shakespeare on the small wooden shelf next to a folded piece of canvas and a worn leather notebook. He looked at the notebook for a moment longer than the other things. Something about it nagged at a memory he couldn't quite locate. He set down his empty cup and prepared to leave because he had stayed longer than he intended, and the light would not hold forever. He had said almost nothing, but at the door he paused. "Your father," he said without turning around. "Thomas Holt." "Yes," said Eliza. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "He did work up here, in the canyon. Long time ago, 30 years, maybe a little more." He turned then and looked at her with the careful expression of a man choosing his words with the precision of someone selecting stones for a load-bearing wall. "There was a mining operation on the North Ridge, a small one. They needed a shelter for the winter crew. Thomas built it." He paused again. "I was 17. I helped him carry stone." Eliza said nothing, but something in her face changed, not dramatically, not in the way of a woman receiving news, but in the way of a woman receiving confirmation of something she had already half understood. "He built it here?" she asked. "In this canyon?" "Against the north wall," Pruitt said. "South facing, under the big overhang."
He looked at the granite wall behind the hearth for a long moment. I couldn't tell you which was his work and which is yours, but the principle is the same. He pulled his coat tighter and went out into the cold without another word, moving back through the snow on his wide ashwood snowshoes, not looking back. Eliza stood at the door and watched him go. Then she turned and went to the back wall and pressed her palm flat against the granite. The warmth came back to her hand in its steady, patient way.
The deep interior warmth of a stone that has been charged and is releasing what it holds.
Her father had stood in this canyon. He had stood against this wall. He had felt this exact warmth 3 decades before she was born into a world that would eventually drive her here by a route he had not planned but had perhaps foreseen. She will know why. She stood there with her hand on the granite for a long time. In Harmony Creek, the winter was conducting its own audit. Reverend Stokes, who had preached about the dangers of pride and the wisdom of community, was burning the wooden pews from the back 3 rows of his church to keep his family from freezing in the attached parsonage. He did this quietly in the early morning hours, splitting the old pine with an axe in the church itself to avoid being seen. By the time anyone noticed the pews were missing, the wood was ash. The Whitmore family on the valley's north edge had lost their barn roof in the second serious storm of the season. A 2-inch sheet of ice had formed over the snow already on the structure, and the combined weight had found the one rafter that was slightly undersized and worked from there. The cattle that survived the collapse were moved into the family's main cabin, which solved the problem of their freezing and created a different set of problems that the Whitmores were too cold and too exhausted to fully process. A young man named Callum Reed, 23 years old, working as a hand on the Aldgate property, had set out one afternoon to check the status of a fence line on the far edge of the property, a journey he had made a dozen times in good weather. The snow that afternoon was not falling, but had already fallen, and the light was the flat, diffused white light that removes all shadow from the world and makes distance and direction into acts of faith rather than perception. He had a compass. He did not fully trust it. He should have trusted it completely. They found him 2 days later, 40 minutes after the temperature finally rose enough to make a search feasible, a 1/4 mile from the Aldgate barn. Standing, that was how it seemed from a distance, standing as if waiting for something in a shallow depression in the snow. His expression when they reached him was almost peaceful. He was 23 years old and had made one small miscalculation about the reliability of his own spatial sense, and the winter had collected on that error with total indifferent efficiency. Inside Devil's Throat, Eliza read her thermometer and added wood to her fire and read Shakespeare by lantern light and did not know about Callum Reed for another week. When she heard about him from Pruitt, who came a second time in December with a taciturn report of the valley's condition, she sat quietly for a moment and then asked about his family. There was no family in the valley, Pruitt said. He had come from somewhere east. She nodded and said nothing more. But that evening, she sat longer than usual with her hand on the warm granite wall, feeling the steady heat come back to her palm, thinking about a young man who had trusted his own judgment over the testimony of an instrument and paid the price that the mountains charge for that particular kind of confidence. The mountains did not care about confidence. They cared about preparation. On the night of November 8th, the night of the first real storm, the storm that Harlan Voss had implicitly promised her would settle the question of her future, she had already gathered the answer she needed. The storm arrived in the late afternoon as a low-pressure system that the sky had been building toward for 3 days, visible in the peculiar color the clouds took on in the high peaks, a bruised yellow-gray that the old-timers recognized and respected. By dusk, the snow had begun, not the gentle, large-flaked snow of milder winters, but small, hard pellets that came in sideways on a wind that had found the canyon opening and was using it as an instrument. The wind in Devil's Throat was a physical thing. It had the directional force of running water in a narrow channel, and it moved through the canyon with a sound that oscillated between a low tonal moan and something that in the worst gusts resembled a human voice pressed to the very edge of its range. For the first hour, Eliza lay on her cot and listened to the canvas roof respond to each gust, a sharp, taut vibration followed by the settling sound of weight and geometry doing their work. The sod above the canvas was frozen now, locked into a solid mass by the cold, and its weight was the argument against the wind's insistence. She had done the mathematics of that weight and that wind over many nights of planning. She had laid the stones on the canvas edges with the knowledge of how much they needed to hold. She did not sleep, but she lay still and let the storm do what it was going to do, and she listened to the structure respond, and she waited. At midnight, she dressed in her heaviest coat and pulled on her gloves and her hat and unbarred the door. The cold that met her was not cold in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a presence. It had density and force and an almost animate quality, as if it were not merely the absence of warmth, but something that had come from somewhere specific and had intentions. It took the breath from her lungs in the first second, and the exposed skin of her face, the strip between her hat brim and her coat collar, registered the temperature, not as sensation, but as something closer to pain. She fumbled for the thermometer with fingers that went numb in 30 seconds. The mercury had dropped to 27 below zero. She got back inside and secured the door and looked at the thermometer hanging on the inner wall. 47 above. She set the outside thermometer on the small wooden shelf and looked at both numbers for a long moment. 74 degrees of differential created by a wall of excavated earth, 3 feet of dry stacked granite, a sod roof, and the deep, patient warmth of an ancient mountain that had been doing this absorbing and releasing storing and giving back since long before any human being had thought to ask it for help. She walked to the back wall and pressed her palm flat against the granite. The warmth came back to her hand, immediately steady and deep. The way water rises to meet you when you push your hand below the surface. She had believed her father. She had built his belief into stone and soil and iron and canvas. And now the belief had become something harder and more durable than belief ever is. It had become fact, demonstrated, measured, recorded in the red line of a mercury thermometer at midnight, in the worst storm the Greystone Valley had seen in 15 years. Eliza Holt stood alone in her buried room and felt for the first time since June something that was not quite happiness, but was in the same neighborhood, the particular satisfaction of a person who has done a difficult thing correctly. Harlan Voss came back in late November. She heard the horses from inside the dugout, an unusual sound. Horses in the canyon, because no one came to Devil's Throat in ordinary times, and certainly not in a winter that was steadily becoming extraordinary. She put on her coat and went to the door and opened it and looked out. He had brought Caden. They sat their horses at the edge of the cleared area in front of the dugout entrance, and the contrast between them and this place was so complete that for a moment Eliza simply observed it the way she observed everything with attention, without comment. Voss looked at the thin column of smoke rising from the canyon wall. He looked at the stacked firewood. He looked at the cleared path and the lean-to and the undeniable organized evidence of a life being conducted with intention and order. His face was a controlled surface, but beneath it, she could see the work of a man who had come expecting one thing and found another, and who had not yet decided what to do with the difference.
"This is still my land,"
he said. His voice was tight, not with cold. "The canyon, the walls, all of it. You have no right to be here." "I have nowhere else to be," Eliza said. It was the same answer she had given him in October, but it meant something different now. In October, it had been a statement of desperation. Now, standing in front of what she had built, it was something closer to a declaration. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document.
"I have a court order," he said, "signed by Judge Harlan of the county seat. You are in violation of land use provisions. You are to vacate this canyon within 7 days.
Eliza looked at the document without taking it, and then from behind her, she heard footsteps on the packed snow. And then more. Rufus Aldgate came out of the shadows to her left, moving carefully on the icy ground, his large hands at his sides. Behind him came a man named Declan Foss, no relation to Harlan. A fact Declan had always found either ironic or unfortunate, depending on his mood, who worked a small cattle operation on the canyon's eastern approach, and had spent the last 10 days in a shelter adjacent to Eliza's learning, as she had taught him how to read the stone for strength and how to build a hearth that heated rock instead of only air. And behind Declan, a third man, older with a gray beard and the broad shoulders of someone who had been doing physical work for 50 years, whose name was August Brierly, and who had come to the canyon 2 weeks ago with a wife and 3 children, and a story about a cabin roof that had simply given up.
The three men stood behind Eliza in the cold and said nothing. They did not need to say anything. Their presence was the statement. Harlan Voss looked at them. He looked at the document in his hand. He looked at Eliza. And for the first time in the 20 years he had been operating in this valley, 20 years of notes and deeds and leverage and the quiet, methodical accumulation of other people's failures, he encountered something his system had not accounted for. He had not accounted for the possibility that the woman he had dispossessed and isolated and left to die might have become, in the course of surviving, something more than a woman fighting for her own life. She had become the person other people came to when their own systems failed. He put the court order back in his coat. He looked at Eliza with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not anger, exactly not the cold calculation she was accustomed to, but something rawer and less managed, something that lived below the surface of the man he had spent his life constructing. "The winter will settle this," he said, and then before she could respond, he turned his horse and rode out of the canyon, Caden following without a word, without looking back. Eliza watched them go. Then she turned to the three men standing behind her. Rufus Aldgate met her eyes with a look that was part gratitude, part something harder to define, the look of a man who has realized that the story he was living in is not the story he thought he was living in, and is still deciding how to feel about that. She nodded at him once, and he nodded back, and they all went inside out of the cold. It was the last week of November. The real cold had not even arrived yet. The real cold came in December, and it came the way the truly serious things always come, not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the quiet, comprehensive certainty of something that has been building toward this moment for a long time and has finally arrived at it. The temperature in the valley fell to 10 below zero, and then to 15, and then in the second week of December to 20 below, where it stopped falling, not because the cold had relented, but because it had found its level, the temperature at which it could sustain itself indefinitely, like a siege army that has taken up its position and has no intention of leaving. The river froze solid, which had not happened in 6 years. Its groaning and cracking echoed through the valley at night, like the sounds of something large and in pain, enormous reports that woke people from sleep and sent them to their windows to look out at the blue-white darkness. In the valley, the situation had moved past difficulty and was approaching something that had no polite name. The Whitmore family, whose barn roof had collapsed in November, lost 4 of their remaining cattle to the cold in a single night, when the temperature in the barn fell below what the animals could sustain. The family itself was surviving barely in a cabin that was warm enough to keep them alive and cold enough to keep them miserable in a way that was beginning to fray the edges of their capacity for endurance. Reverend Stokes had burned the last of the back pews. He was now looking at the front ones with the expression of a man weighing theological symbolism against thermal necessity. In the valley's general understanding, Eliza Holt was still a cautionary tale. She was the woman who had chosen pride over practicality
and gone into the canyon to die on her own terms. The fact that no one had found her body was filed in the communal ledger of Harmony Creek under the category of things they would rather not think about directly. They did not know about Rufus Aldgate's shelter. They did not know about Declan Foss or August Brierly. They did not know that Devil's Throat, the place the valley had always treated as a wasteland and a danger, had become over the course of November and December a small and unlikely community of people who had learned from a 24-year-old woman with a geological hammer and a dead man's notebook how to make the mountain work for them instead of against them.
Inside her dugout, Eliza tracked the valley's condition through the reports that came to her from Stellan Pruitt, who came every 10 days or so, and delivered information in the same terse, factual way he delivered everything without editorial comment or emotional coloring. From Rufus Aldgate, who had connections throughout the valley and received visitors at his shelter, with a hospitality that was becoming gradually something like a community function, and from the simple, observable physics of her thermometer, which told her every time she checked it that the differential between her world and the world outside remained stable and sufficient.
One evening in the middle of December, the night the temperature outside fell to 23 below zero, and the inside of her shelter held at 43 above, and the granite wall radiated its steady warmth into the small room where she sat reading. By lantern light, she heard a sound at her door that she had not been expecting. Not the wind, not the ox shifting in his lean-to. A knock. Not a single knock. A repeated rhythmic knocking with the particular quality of urgency that is different from simple persistence. The kind of knocking that contains information that tells you before you open the door that what is on the other side of it has already crossed some threshold. She set down her book and went to the door and unbarred it. The man standing there was Rufus Aldgate. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with the heavy forearms of someone who had spent his adult life in physical work, and he was carrying his wife. She was wrapped in a wool blanket that had been pulled over her coat and hat, and even in the lantern light, even with most of her face covered, her color was wrong, the bluish, waxy pallor that Eliza had been taught to recognize as the body beginning to redirect its resources away from the extremities and toward the core.
Behind Aldgate, pressing close together in the cold, were 2 children, a girl of perhaps 8 and a boy of 5 or 6. They were shivering in the specific way that children shiver when the cold has gotten past the surface and started working on something deeper, not the ordinary shiver of discomfort, but the whole body trembling of a system under serious stress. "The chimney," Aldgate said. His voice was rough and compressed, the voice of a man conserving everything, even breath. "It iced over. Flue closed up. We didn't know until the cabin filled with smoke. We had to go out." He did not need to say the rest. She could see it in the children's faces, in the color of his wife's hands where they showed at the edge of the blanket. She stepped back from the door. "Come inside," she said. She worked quickly and without wasted motion, because wasted motion in a situation like this was something she could not afford, and neither could they. She cleared space on the cot for the wife whose name was Nora. She learned when Aldgate said it in a low, careful voice, as if the name itself required handling, and brought the children close to the hearth, not touching it, but close enough for the radiant heat to begin its work immediately. She heated broth. She had a pot of it on the back of the hearth, a habit she had developed because it cost little to keep it warm, and the value of having it immediately available was potentially significant. She poured it into the tin cups she had and brought them to the children first, making them drink slowly in small sips, watching their color and their breathing. The boy's hands, when she took them in hers to check the fingers for frostbite, were cold in a way that made her chest tighten. The fingertips were white. She wrapped her own hands around his sharing warmth, directly the oldest and most efficient technology for this particular problem, and held them until the color began slowly to return. The girl was in better shape. She had kept her hands inside her coat sleeves. Children, Eliza thought, were sometimes smarter about these things than adults because they were smaller and felt the cold faster and adjusted sooner. Nora Aldgate regained full consciousness within the hour, which was the best possible sign. The hypothermia had not gone deep. She was exhausted and shaken, but her color came back and her speech cleared, and she held the cup of broth in her own hands and drank it herself, which told Eliza everything she needed to know about the prognosis. Rufus sat on the low stool near the hearth and watched Eliza work and said nothing, which was how he always was. But his eyes tracked everything she did with an attention that was different from observation. It was the attention of a man who is learning something and knows he is learning it and intends to remember. By 2 a.m, the immediate crisis had passed. Nora was sleeping on the cot. The children were curled together on a folded blanket near the hearth, their breathing slow and regular, the color back in their faces. Rufus and Eliza sat across from each other in the low lantern light. Outside, the temperature had dropped another 2 degrees. The granite wall radiated its steady, unhurried warmth. "The chimney," Rufus said. "How do you prevent it from icing?" It was not a casual question. It was the question of a man who had just watched his children turn blue and intended to make sure it never happened again. Eliza explained the design of her chimney, the angle, the clearance, the way the heat of the rising smoke created enough of a temperature differential at the flue opening to prevent ice formation in all but the most extreme conditions. She explained the maintenance, the practice of checking the draw every morning. By watching the smoke behavior before the fire was fully established, the way to clear a partial blockage safely, the modifications that could be added to an existing chimney to improve its cold weather performance. She drew a diagram on the back of a page from the worn notebook she kept for practical notes, tracing the cross-section of the chimney channel, annotating it with the specific measurements and angles. Rufus studied the diagram in the lantern light. He asked 2 precise questions. She answered them. He folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the children breathe. "Why are you doing this?" he asked eventually. Not the rescue that required no explanation. The other thing, the teaching, the sharing. Eliza thought about the question for a moment. "Because the knowledge doesn't belong to me," she said. "It belonged to my father. He gave it to me. The only thing I can do with it that makes any sense is pass it along." Rufus looked at the granite wall for a moment, the wall that was warm to the touch, that had been holding its heat since October, that was storing in its ancient crystalline structure the memory of 1,000 fires built against its face. "Your father knew this canyon," he said. It was not a question. Stellan Pruitt had apparently been talking. "He built something here once," Eliza said, "a long time ago. And he left you the plans." "He left me the notebook," she said. "The plans were already in the rock. He just knew how to read them." In the morning, Eliza did not ask the Aldgates to stay. She gave Rufus her second pick and her spare shovel and walked him 20 yards down the canyon wall to a section of the north face she had already assessed and marked in her notes. She showed him where the overhang was solid, where the soil was deep enough to work with, where to position the hearth for maximum effect. She gave him the notebook page with the chimney diagram. She answered every question he asked, and then she stepped back and let him work, because the most important thing she could give him was not shelter. It was the knowledge to build shelter. The difference between those two things was the difference between surviving one winter and surviving all the winters that came after. Rufus Aldgate looked at the rock face for a long moment. Then he set the pick against his shoulder and began. The deepest cold came without announcement. It did not arrive on the back of a storm, did not come wrapped in wind and snow and the dramatic vocabulary of a season, making its intentions known. It arrived the way the most serious things arrive, quietly in the dark, while everyone was occupied with the smaller difficulties of staying alive. The second week of January 1884. The sky cleared on a Monday evening, the clouds pulling back from the peaks with the suddenness of a curtain drawn aside, and what replaced them was a sky so black and so dense with stars that it seemed to have weight, seemed to press down on the valley with the cold clarity of something that had been waiting behind the clouds for weeks and had finally been given room to work. By Tuesday morning, the temperature in the Greystone Valley had fallen to 31 degrees below zero. Eliza knew the number before she opened the door. She could feel it in the particular quality of the silence. A silence that was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so cold that even sound moved through it differently, slower, flatter, as if the air itself had thickened into a medium that resisted transmission. She dressed completely before opening the door. Every layer, coat, second coat hat, pulled low scarf across the face until only her eyes were exposed. She unbarred the door and pushed it open against the resistance of the cold that pressed against it from outside, as if the night had left something solid leaning against the wood. The thermometer read 31 below. She looked at it for the 30 seconds her fingers could sustain exposure, then got back inside, and secured the door and turned to the thermometer on the inner wall. 42 above. She stood in the center of her small room and looked at both numbers in her mind for a moment. The number outside and the number inside, and the 73 degrees of difference between them. 73 degrees of difference created by stone and soil and a dead man's knowledge, and 10 weeks of work that had nearly broken her body before it became the architecture of her survival. She went to the back wall and pressed her palm flat against the granite. The warmth came back to her hand in its steady, patient way. The deep interior warmth of stone that has been charged through weeks of careful fire-keeping. The warmth of a mountain that has been doing this work, absorbing, storing, releasing for longer than the human concept of time extends. The stone did not know about January. The stone did not know about Harlan Voss or dead men's debts or the verdict of a valley that had decided she was already finished. The stone only knew what it had been taught by the sun and the fire and the slow pressure of geological time. It remembered summer. Eliza Holt stood with her hand on the warm granite at 31 below zero and allowed herself for the first time since October to do something she had not permitted herself through all the weeks of building and surviving and teaching and enduring. She leaned her forehead against the wall. She stood like that for a long time, feeling the warmth move from the stone into her face, steady and unhurried and absolute. And then quietly, in the way that things happen when there is no audience to perform for and no pride to maintain, she began to cry. Not the single night of tears she had allowed herself in October when the canvas collapsed and the cold and the exhaustion had briefly overwhelmed her capacity to continue. Those tears had been the tears of a person near a breaking point. These were different. These were the tears of a person who had held something enormous for a very long time and had finally, in one specific moment, in the warmth of an ancient wall at 31 below zero, found a place safe enough to set it down. She cried for Daniel, who had been a man of bright, reckless hopes and poor calculations, and who had loved her in the imperfect, well-intentioned way of someone who is always slightly more focused on the future than the present. She cried for the life she had expected to have, the one that had seemed in the early years of their marriage to be assembling itself around them the way a house assembles itself, slowly, imperfectly, but with the general shape of something real and lasting. She cried for her father, who had taught her everything that mattered, and had known perhaps that it would matter in ways he could not fully predict, and who had left her a notebook with a page marked and 4 words written in the margin, and was not here to see what she had done with what he gave her. She cried for about 4 minutes. Then she straightened up, wiped her face on her sleeve, and went to feed the ox. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The community in Devil's Throat had grown by mid-January to include 4 families and 7 individuals, 11 people in total, not counting children of whom there were 6. Each family or group had built their own shelter according to the principles Eliza had demonstrated, each one slightly different in its specifics, adapted to the particular section of wall or overhang that was available to them, each one a practical expression of the same underlying idea. The canyon, which the valley had always treated as a dead end, a waste, a danger, had become something that it had never been in the memory of the people who lived nearby. It had become a place where people were warm. The community had no formal structure, no elected leaders, no charter or rules beyond the practical ones that cold and necessity impose on any group of people who share a confined space and a common interest in not dying. They checked on each other in the mornings, a system that had developed organically without discussion, because the first time one of Declan Foss's children had not appeared for their morning check, and it had turned out to be nothing more serious than the child sleeping late. The relief that moved through the canyon when the small face appeared at the shelter door was so comprehensive that the practice became permanent and unquestioned. They shared meals on Saturday evenings, rotating the location, bringing whatever each family could contribute to a communal pot that was never quite as full as anyone would have liked, but was always somehow sufficient. The children played in the canyon on the days when the light was good and the wind was manageable. The canyon floor in those weeks was a world of compressed snow and ice and shadow, and the occasional brilliant shaft of winter sun that found the right angle and lit the granite walls in a way that made them glow briefly with a color that was close to gold. Eliza watched all of this from the practiced distance of a woman who has become the center of something she did not set out to create and is not entirely sure how to feel about the responsibility. She helped where she was needed. She taught whenever someone asked, and sometimes when they didn't, because she had learned to recognize the look of a person who needs information but has not yet formulated the question. She maintained her routines, the fire, the ox, the thermometer, the book, the slow ongoing refinements to her shelter that were less about necessity now and more about the satisfaction of doing something well. She was in the deep and uncomplicated sense of the word home. Caden Voss came to her on a Thursday morning in the second week of January. She heard him coming from some distance because the snow in the canyon at that point was packed and dense, and footsteps on it had a particular resonance in the enclosed space. And she had developed over the weeks the habit of knowing who was approaching by the sound of their walk before she could see them. Caden's walk was distinctive, slightly hesitant, as if each step were a small decision that he was making in real time, rather than committing to in advance. She was outside when he arrived, checking the upper joint of her chimney where she had noticed a slight reduction in draw that morning. She heard him round the corner of the lean-to and turned to look at him.
He was alone. No horse he had come on foot, which meant he had come quietly, which meant he had not told his uncle he was coming. He was dressed well enough for the cold, which was one of the benefits of being Harlan Voss's nephew, but his face had a look that good clothing could not address, the look of someone
who has been carrying something for a long time and has finally decided to let it down regardless of the consequences.
He stopped a few feet away from her and stood there in the cold. I left the bag of nails in October, he said. At your door. Eliza looked at him. She had found the bag on a morning in early November, a canvas sack containing iron nails, a length of good rope, and a small coil of wire left without explanation or signature. She had used every item in it. I know, she said. She had not known at the time, but she had suspected, and the suspicion had solidified into certainty over the weeks, without her ever examining it directly. Some certainties don't require examination. Caden nodded, as if the acknowledgement were something he had needed. He looked at the chimney at the shelter at the stacked firewood, with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite admiration, but contained elements of both. I have something else, he said. He reached inside his coat and produced a small book. Not a notebook, but a proper ledger, the kind used for business accounts, its cover worn, but its pages protected by the cover's structure. He held it out to her. She took it and opened it. The handwriting was Harlan Voss's. She recognized it from the deed from the loan documents, from the severe angular script that she had studied with careful attention on the day she realized she was looking at a mechanism rather than a transaction. But this was not the ledger she had seen. This was different in the way that a private face is different from a public one. The entries were explicit. The sale of seed grain to Daniel Holt. June 1883. The grain described in the internal notes, not the sales document, as second-quality remainder stock unfit for primary planting. The price recorded internally, and then the price recorded for the external transaction and the difference between them. The loan issued 3 weeks later when the expected harvest failure had occurred as calculated. The interest terms, which were not the terms Voss had presented to Daniel. The whole architecture of it laid out in Harlan Voss's own precise handwriting. Because a man who has spent 20 years building these mechanisms eventually stops worrying about the evidence and starts trusting in the power that has always protected him from its consequences. Eliza read for a long time. The cold did not touch her. He doesn't know you have this, she said. It was not a question. No,
said Caden. He was looking at his boots.
He keeps it locked. I've known where the key was for 3 years.
He paused.
I've known what was in it for 2.
Eliza closed the ledger and looked at him. You've had this for 2 years, she said.
I've had access to it,
he said. The distinction was careful, precise. The distinction of a young man who has been parsing his own culpability for a long time and has become very exact about the language. I took it 2 weeks ago, when the Aldgate children came through the canyon half frozen. He finally looked up from his boots and met her eyes. I couldn't. He stopped, started again. I kept thinking there was a line somewhere, that he would stop before he crossed it. But there isn't a line. There's just...
He gestured vaguely at the canyon, at the shelters, at the whole improbable community of people keeping themselves alive in a place the valley had written off. There's just this.
Eliza held the ledger for a moment, feeling its weight. You came here late, she said. Her voice was even, not cruel, precise. Yes, said Caden. But you came. She looked at him a moment longer. That matters, not as much as coming sooner would have mattered, but it matters. She put the ledger inside her coat against her body where the important things went. Then she looked at the chimney joint she had been examining before he arrived. As long as you're here, she said, I need someone to hold the ladder. Caden Voss held the ladder. They did not speak much after that. There was not much to say that the ledger had not already said, and Eliza had learned over the course of a winter spent in close company with stone that silence was not an absence, but a presence, and that sometimes the most important conversations happened in it. When the work was done, she offered him tea, which he accepted. He sat on the low stool near the hearth in the warmth of the granite wall and drank it in the particular careful way of a person who is not accustomed to having things offered to them without cost. When he left, he did not tell her where he was going.
She did not ask. Some things were not her business to manage.
The collapse of Harlan Voss's world was not dramatic. It had the quality of his own methods turned back on him, methodical, quiet, proceeding in increments that were each individually manageable, until suddenly they weren't. The roof section above the east wing of his house had been showing strain since early December. A long crack in the plaster ceiling that he had noted and deferred the way men who are accustomed to controlling their circumstances defer things they do not want to address directly. In the third week of January, after a night in which the temperature had stayed at 20 below for 10 consecutive hours, and a thin layer of ice had formed over the foot of snow already on the roof, the strain became a fact. The section came down in the early morning, taking a rafter and a section of wall with it opening the east wing to the sky. It was not catastrophic. The main section of the house was intact, but the east wing was where they stored the firewood, the substantial, carefully accumulated supply that had been Voss's primary argument against vulnerability. The wood was now under 4 feet of snow and ice and collapsed timber accessible in theory and inaccessible in practice. The firewood they had in the main house would last, by Voss's careful calculation, 9 more days. His network, the system of obligations and dependencies that had functioned for 20 years as both his business and his protection, had contracted over the course of the winter to something that was no longer functional. The men who owed him money were surviving their own crises. The men who owed him loyalty were occupied with the more immediate loyalty of keeping their families alive. Caden was gone, which Voss had discovered on a Wednesday morning and had processed in private without expression in the way he processed everything that presented itself as a vulnerability. He sat in the main room of his house on a Saturday evening, 9 days before his wood supply ran out, and conducted the accounting that he had been postponing for weeks. It was not a comfortable accounting.
He was a man who had spent 40 years building a system designed to ensure that he would never be dependent on the goodwill of other people. He had understood from early in his life that goodwill was unreliable, that it was subject to the fluctuations of emotion and circumstance in ways that made it an unsuitable foundation for anything serious. So he had built instead on obligation, on leverage, on the documented dependency of others, which was durable in the way that contracts are durable, enforceable, by mechanisms that did not require anyone to feel warmly toward him.
The winter had not destroyed this system. It had simply revealed that the system had a boundary condition. He had not accounted for a temperature at which obligation ceased to be a more powerful motivator than survival, and at which leverage ceased to function because the people being leveraged had nothing left to give. He had built his security on other people's weakness. He had not built it on his own strength. He sat with that understanding for a long time in the room that was getting colder by degrees as the fire in the hearth consumed wood that could not be replaced. On Sunday evening, he put on his coat. Caden was waiting for him outside. He had come back not to the house, but near enough to see the smoke from the chimney getting thinner, which told him what he needed to know. He said nothing when his uncle appeared. He simply fell into step beside him. They walked 4 miles through the January dark, through snow that was chest deep in the drifts and knee-deep in the packed areas between them, through cold that stripped the moisture from the air and left it feeling brittle like something that would shatter if struck. Caden had brought a lantern. It made a small moving circle of yellow light in the vast blue-dark landscape.
Harlan Voss had not walked 4 miles in 20 years. His legs by the second mile were conducting their objection in terms that were impossible to ignore. He ignored them anyway because there was nothing else to do. The light from the canyon, the thin, warm light that came from the shelters built against the walls, visible as a pale, diffused glow when you were close enough, appeared at the end of the 3rd mile like something he had no category for. He had not expected it to look like that. He had expected desperation, improvisation, the temporary and fragile arrangement of a woman who had gotten lucky for longer than anyone anticipated. The glow was not temporary. It had the quality of permanence. It had the quality of something that had been thought through. He stopped at the mouth of the canyon and stood in the cold and looked at it. Caden stopped beside him and also looked and said nothing because there was nothing to add. They walked the last 1/4 mile into the canyon, moving carefully on the packed snow of the path that had been maintained by weeks of daily use. The path itself told a story, the story of a community that had established its routines and was keeping them regardless of the cold, the story of a place that was functioning. The sound reached them before the shelters were fully visible, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The sound of children. 2 of them, by the sound, having some kind of argument that was just barely on the warm side of playful, their voices sharp and clear in the cold air. Harlan Voss stopped again. He stood in the path, and looked at the shelter that Eliza Holt had built, the low mound of earth with its thin column of smoke rising from the canyon wall, the cleared path, the stacked firewood, the lean-to against the eastern side where the ox stood in patient warmth. And beside it and beyond it, 4 other structures in various stages of completion, each one a variation on the same theme, each one breathing its thin column of smoke into the dark air. He had left her here to die. He stood in the path and looked at what she had built instead, and the accounting that he had begun in his chair 9 days ago reached in this moment its final entry. The door to Eliza's shelter opened, and she stood in the doorway backlit by the lantern light within, looking at them. She had heard them coming. She had been hearing people coming for weeks, and had developed an accurate ear for the distinction between the gaits of different people. She had known who it was from the moment they entered the canyon's acoustic range. She had had time between hearing them and seeing them to decide. She looked at Harlan Voss in the lantern light. He was a diminished version of the man who had ridden up to her cabin in October, not physically, not in the obvious ways, but in some more fundamental dimension. The largeness that had been the defining quality of his presence. The largeness that was not about his physical size, but about the space he occupied in the consciousness of everyone around him, was gone. What remained was a man in his 60s who was cold and tired and had walked 4 miles through the dark to the one place he had spent the winter hoping would fail. He did not speak. She had not expected him to. The language he had spent his life using was a language of leverage and documentation, and the assertion of legal right, and none of those currencies were valid here. He had nothing to say in any language he possessed. Eliza looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Caden, who was standing beside his uncle with the expression of a man who has done something he is not yet sure was the right thing, but has done it anyway because the alternative was becoming someone he didn't want to be. She looked at Voss again. Caden's breathing, she noticed, was wrong, too shallow, too quick, with a crackling quality at the bottom of each exhale that she recognized as the beginning stages of something that needed attention before it became something that couldn't be managed. She stepped back from the door. She did not say, "Come in." She did not say, "You're welcome here," or "I forgive you," or any of the things that the moment might have called for in a story with a different kind of architecture. She simply stepped back from the door and turned to the hearth and added a piece of wood to the fire and lifted the pot of broth from the back edge and set it on the front where it would heat faster. And she left the door open. Harlan Voss stood in the cold for another moment. Then he walked through the door. Caden followed. She examined Caden's chest with her hands and her ear, listening to the quality of his breathing, with the focused attention of a woman who had been paying close attention to the way living things sound when they are under stress for the past 3 months. The crackling she had heard was there in the lower right lobe, a wet, resistant quality that was early but unambiguous. She prepared a poultice from the dried herbs she kept in a tin on the upper shelf, comfrey and mullein, and a small amount of camphor, and applied it to his chest with a cloth, instructing him to sit near the warmth of the granite wall and breathe slowly. and deliberately. She gave Voss a cup of broth and pointed to the low stool near the hearth. He sat.
He sat on the low stool in the warmth of the dugout that his dispossession had built in the warmth of the mountain that his cruelty had accidentally directed her toward, and drank his cup of broth in small, careful sips, and looked at the granite wall that was warm to the touch at 31 degrees below zero, and said nothing for a long time. Eliza moved around the small space in her efficient, unhurried way, checking on Caden, adding wood to the fire, filling the broth cups again. She did not look at Voss except when it was practically necessary. She did not perform her forgiveness. She did not offer him absolution or confrontation or any of the emotional transactions he might have expected. She offered him warmth. She offered him broth. She offered him a stool near the fire.
She offered him exactly what she had offered everyone else who had come to her in need, in the same measure, with the same absence of ceremony. At some point in the night, it might have been 2 a.m, it might have been later, Voss looked up from his cup and looked at the wall. The granite wall, warm and patient and indifferent to everything that human beings brought to it. "How does it do that?" he said. It was barely a question, more like thinking aloud. "It remembers," Eliza said without looking up from the mending she had returned to. "Stone holds heat. The fire charges it. The mountain holds what you give it and gives it back slow." Silence. "Your father taught you that," Voss said. "Yes." Another silence longer. "I knew Thomas Holt," Voss said. His voice had a quality it had never had in any previous conversation she had heard from him. Not soft exactly, but reduced. Stripped of its instrument-like efficiency, what remained was something older and less processed. "Not well, but I knew him." Eliza did not respond. She kept her needle moving. "He was the most competent man I ever met," Voss said. "At what he did." A pause. "I never told him that." Eliza set her mending down in her lap and looked at the wall for a moment. "He knew," she said. "Men like my father always know. They just don't need you to say it." Voss looked at the cup in his hands for a long time. "And men like me," he said, "need everyone to say it, need everyone to know it, need everyone to—" He stopped. The sentence had taken him somewhere he hadn't expected. Eliza picked up her mending and kept working. There was nothing to add. The granite wall said the rest in its steady, unhurried way, radiating the patience of something that has been standing in one place for longer than pride has been a concept, and will continue standing in one place long after it ceases to matter. The spring thaw came in the 3rd week of March, arriving with the gradual incremental quality of all the season's changes in the high country. Not a single dramatic warming, but a slow accumulation of degrees each day, a fraction warmer than the last. The snow retreating upward from the lower elevations as the sun climbed higher in the sky and began once again to charge the rock. On a Wednesday morning in the last week of March,
Eliza Holt walked from Devil's Throat to the county seat. It was a longer walk than Harmony Creek, and a harder one in the transitional snow, and she made it alone, carrying in the inner pocket of her coat a worn leather notebook and a business ledger that had been kept under lock and key until a young man with a troubled conscience had decided that locks were not the same thing as truth. The county recorder's office was a small cold room that smelled of paper and oil. The man behind the desk, whose name she never asked and who never offered it, looked at the documents she placed on the surface in front of him with the careful, expressionless attention of a professional who has learned to let facts speak before he does. He read for 20 minutes. He asked 3 questions. She answered them precisely. He made several notes in his own ledger. He asked her to come back in 4 days. She came back in 4 days. The document he had prepared was a single page, clean and formal, with the county seal and his signature. It reversed the deed transfer of October 1883 on the grounds of fraudulent inducement, citing specific entries in the accounting ledger as evidence of deliberate manipulation. The original homestead was restored to Eliza Holt, widow of Daniel Holt, in full. She thanked him. She walked back to Devil's Throat. Harlan Voss signed the confirming paperwork without appearing at the county seat, without contest, without the legal challenge that he could theoretically have mounted and would in a different season of his life certainly have pursued. He signed it in the main room of his house, sitting at his desk with a pen that had signed 1,000 documents over 20 years. And the signature looked exactly like all the others. But the hand that made it was the hand of a man who had held something warm that was not his, and had finally, at some point in a long January night, understood the difference between holding and owning. He never recovered his position in the valley's economic life. Not because the community made any formal decision against him, but because the community had rearranged itself over the winter in ways that no longer required the center of gravity to be wherever Harlan Voss decided to stand. The Aldgate family, the Foss operation, August Brierly's homestead. They had all come through the winter, not just surviving, but reorganized around a different principle, a principle that had to do with shared knowledge and mutual practical obligation rather than debt and dependency. Voss lived in the valley for 2 more years, diminished in the gradual, undramatic way of a man whose context has changed around him. He sold the general store to a partnership of 3 Valley families in 1885 and moved to Denver, where he lived quietly for the rest of his life. He was not unhappy there, as far as anyone knew. He was simply finished with a certain kind of ambition. Caden Voss recovered from his lung inflammation over the course of February, aided by Eliza's poultices and the warm, stable air of the canyon shelter. He stayed in the valley. He learned to read stone slowly and imperfectly, but with genuine attention. And in the years that followed, he became, among other things, a reliable source of practical building knowledge in a community that was beginning to understand the value of building with the land rather than against it. He and Eliza were not close exactly. They were something more specific than that two people who had stood on opposite sides of an event that defined both of them, and who had each in their different ways come out of it, changed in directions they were still discovering.
Stellan Pruitt came to the canyon in April when the snow had cleared enough for a horse and stood in front of Holt's Hold, which was what people had begun calling it, without any formal decision, the way names attach to places that have earned them, and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Eliza. "Your father would have had opinions," he said. "He always had opinions," Eliza said. "Good ones, mostly." "Yes," she said, "mostly good ones."
Eliza Holt never moved back to the log cabin on the original homestead. The deed was hers, and the land was hers, and she accepted both with the same practical acknowledgement with which she accepted everything that came to her, noting it, incorporating it, moving on. But the log cabin was Daniel's dream, and Daniel was gone, and the thing she was living now was something that had grown out of her own understanding of the world rather than anyone else's. She stayed in Devil's Throat. Over the following years, as the practical lessons of the hard winter of 1883 worked their way into the building practices of the valley, the original dugout became the heart of a larger dwelling. Rooms added one by one, each one excavated and finished with the mason's patience that she had inherited from her father, and extended through her own long years of practice. Stone walls 3 feet thick, ceilings of sod and timber, and compressed earth that held the summer cool and the winter warm in equal measure. Hearths built to heat rock instead of only air. Holt's Hold grew the way things grow, when they are given time and tended with knowledge, slowly, organically. Each addition responsive to what was already there, rather than imposed upon it. In the summer of 1895, a geologist named Aldous Pemberton came to the Greystone Valley from the Colorado School of Mines in Golden. He had heard the story through the channels by which these stories eventually travel from Stellan Pruitt to a traveling surveyor to a professor of geological engineering who had been looking for some time for examples of what he called vernacular thermal architecture, which was his way of describing what ordinary people had discovered through necessity and observation about the way stone and earth manage heat. Pemberton spent a week with Eliza measuring and drawing, and filling a notebook with the kind of precise annotated diagrams that require real engagement with what they are documenting. He was a careful man, respectful in his questions, genuinely interested in the principles rather than the story. He asked about the chimney design. He asked about the hearth placement relative to the thermal mass of the back wall. He asked about the depth of the excavation relative to the frost line and the relationship between the overhang geometry and the solar gain from the low winter sun. She answered everything he asked. She showed him her father's notebook, the marked page, the 4 words written in the margin. She explained as clearly as she could the difference between a principle and a technique, that the principle was the relationship between thermal mass and sustained temperature, and that the techniques were simply the various ways of expressing that principle in whatever materials the land made available. He published his findings in a journal the following year. He described the work at Holt's Hold with precision, and she thought, when she finally read the article, genuine respect.
He named the principle correctly. He credited her father's geological understanding as the foundational insight and her own practical engineering as the application that had demonstrated it could sustain human life through conditions that conventional building practices had failed to address. She declined his invitation to lecture at the school. She declined the small honorarium he offered for the use of the material. She kept her father's notebook and sent Pemberton away with her blessing and a clear conscience. "The knowledge doesn't belong to me," she told him, as she had told Rufus Aldgate on a cold December night in a different world. "It belongs to the stone." He wrote that down too.
The valley changed over the following decades in ways that were partly the ordinary drift of time and partly the specific consequence of the winter of 1883 and what it had taught. New barns were built with their north walls set into hillsides. New houses were given stone foundations that extended below the frost line, and thick hearths positioned against exterior stone walls and roof designs that acknowledged the weight of snow as a fact to be accommodated rather than an aberration to be ignored. The lessons were not taught in any formal sense. They were demonstrated. They were built into the landscape in the slow, cumulative way of knowledge that has proven itself under conditions that were impossible to argue with. Eliza Holt lived in Holt's Hold for 53 years. She never remarried, and this was not a deprivation, but a choice made with the same deliberate attention she brought to all her choices. She was not lonely. She was solitary, which is a different country with a different climate, and she had learned over the long years to be fluent in its particular language. She kept her father's notebook on the shelf above her desk until the pages became too fragile to handle regularly. And then she copied its contents in her own handwriting into a new notebook and put both on the shelf side by side, the old and the new, the original knowledge and its continuation. She was 77 years old in the January of 1936, and the winter that year was mild by Greystone standards. And she went to bed on a Tuesday night with a fire banked in the hearth and her hand resting on the warm granite wall in the habitual way of someone greeting a presence that has been constant for half a century. She did not wake up. It was a good death in the way that the deaths of people who have done what they came to do are good. Not happy, not easy, but complete. Like a sentence that has found its final word and can rest. The granite wall was warm. Decades later, in the particular quality of light that belongs to late afternoon in the Colorado high country, the light that makes stone glow and distance feel both vast and intimate, two hikers came down the eastern side of the Greystone Range and found almost by accident the entrance to a canyon that their map labeled with a name that meant nothing to them. They were tired, and the canyon was sheltered from the wind, and they went in. What they found there was a ruin in the technical sense. The wooden elements long since returned to the earth, the canvas gone. The sod roof collapsed into the rooms below, but the stone walls stood. They were standing the way stone walls stand when they have been built by someone who understood the weight they were meant to carry and fitted them accordingly, not dramatic,
not imposing, simply present with the particular permanence of things that were made to last and have. They explored the space with the mild, companionable curiosity of people who have stumbled onto something they do not have the context to fully understand. One of them, on an impulse she couldn't have explained, gathered a handful of dry sticks from the floor of the canyon and built a small fire in the blackened hearth against the back wall. The draw still worked. The smoke rose cleanly through the chimney channel, finding its way up the granite face by the route that had been designed for it a century before. They stayed an hour talking about small things in the warmth of the small fire, and then scattered the embers carefully and went on. That evening, returning by the same path in the fading light, one of them paused at the entrance to the canyon. On an impulse that felt in retrospect less like impulse and more like the response to something she had heard without recognizing as sound, she turned back and walked the short distance to the shelter entrance and reached through the low doorway and pressed her hand flat against the great granite wall. She held it there. The stone was warm. Not from the fire they had built an hour ago. An hour was not enough time. She understood for a small fire to charge a wall of this mass to any meaningful degree. The warmth she was feeling had been there before they arrived. Had been there in some continuous unbroken thread of thermal memory through the decades since the last fire had been banked in this hearth, through the long years since the woman who had designed this system had pressed her own hand against this same wall and felt the mountain give back what it had been given. She stood in the doorway of the ruin with her hand on the warm granite in the failing light of a Colorado afternoon and did not fully understand what she was touching. She only knew that it was warm, and that warmth radiating from the deep interior of something ancient and patient and indifferent to the brief, bright urgency of human suffering, was the last word of a conversation that had begun in the winter of 1883, when a young woman with a geological hammer and a dead man's notebook had pressed her own hand against this same stone and heard in the warmth that came back to her palm the steady, unhurried voice of a mountain telling her that it remembered, that it had always remembered, that it would go on remembering long after the memory of her name had faded from the valley that had tried to forget her, long after the valley itself had changed beyond recognition, long after everything that human beings build and lose and mourn and celebrate had come and gone and come again. The stone remembers summer, and summer, in the deep grammar of the mountain, has no opposite